Today we'll be continuing discussing some arguments for the existence of God. In particular, we'll be discussing the ontological argument and an argument from sufficient reason for the existence of God. So, ontological argument. Design arguments, as we saw in last lecture, appeal to empirical experience to attempt to show that God exists. But another sort of argument, ontological argument for the existence of God, appeals to nothing more than rationality and logic, as we'll see. Now, the first such ontological argument was developed by the philosopher Anselm. Anselm claimed the following was an accurate definition of God. X is God if and only if X is the being than which none greater can be conceived. That is to say, God is that thing such that you can't conceive of anything greater than it. Anselm then argued that because you can't imagine anything greater than God, and because it's better to exist in reality than just in the mind, that God must exist in reality and not just in the mind. Because if God just existed in the mind, then you could imagine something greater than God, namely, something just like God, except it exists in reality. Let's look at this a little more formally. Premise 1. If God exists only in the intellect, then we can conceive of a being greater than God. Premise 2. If we cannot conceive of a being greater than God. Hence, it's not the case God exists only in the intellect. Now, either God exists only in the intellect or God exists in reality. Hence, God exists in reality. Now, this is certainly valid. Is it sound? Look, think of this first premise. Suppose God exists only in the intellect. Then we can conceive of something just like God, but existing in reality too. That being would be greater than God, according to Anselm. Now consider this, premise 2. According to Anselm, God is by definition the being than which none greater can be conceived. God is then the greatest being we can conceive. So, according to Anselm, premise 2 is true. Now 3 follows from logic, and 4 is a truth of logic. God exists in reality or not. If God exists in reality, then 4 is true, right? Now, if God doesn't exist in reality, then since we've at least conceived of God, God exists in the intellect. Hence, 4 is true. Either way, 4 is true. That's why it's a truth of logic. And 5, of course, follows just by logic again. So, is this sound? I mean, we've just seen some justification, at least the justification that Anselm gives for the premises. But what do you think? Sound? Not sound? Now, we're going to try to evaluate this for soundness, but I should note this is a notoriously challenging argument to evaluate. Most philosophers believe it's unsound, but nobody really knows why. Nobody knows what premise to object to. You might be inclined to object to line 1. If God exists only in the intellect, then we can conceive of a being greater than God, since it assumes existing in reality is better than just existing in the intellect. That is required for this justification, right? That being in reality is better than just being in the mind. Consider this, though. Suppose you learn your entire life has been a simulation, and any pain and pleasure, decision, etc. that you see manifested in the world has really just been some sophisticated virtual reality simulation. Suppose when you learn this, you're given the option to live in the actual world or continue to live in your simulation. Importantly, very importantly, nothing in your past, present, or future will change either way. If you stay in the sim, everything will be the same as far as you experience. If you go into reality, everything will be the same as far as you experience. It won't even be a shock to transition. It'll be seamless. You won't even notice. You'll experience the same loves, losses, successes, and failures. The only difference is that you'll be in a simulation or in reality. Now look, if you feel any pull towards living in reality from this thought experiment, then I think you understand intuitively what it means for being in reality to be better than just being in the intellect. There's something about the authenticity of being in reality that is just not captured in being in a simulation. Similarly, there's just something about the authenticity of being in reality versus being in the intellect only. And that's the sort of intuition that's underwriting line 1. You might instead object to line 2, namely that we cannot conceive of a being greater than God. Now, the plausibility of this line depends on the plausibility of course, Anselm's definition of God. But think about it. Is it not the case that God is that thing no greater than which can be conceived? I mean, that seems intuitive, right? Well, I don't know. Some people have objected to it. Let's look at an objection in some detail. This is one of Anselm's contemporaries, posed a response almost immediately. Gaunlio targeted Anselm's entire argument, though not by attacking a particular premise. Gaunlio parodied Anselm's definition of God by asserting the following of a fantastical island. X is a grand island if and only if X is the island greater than which none can be conceived. I mean, it's got everything. Anything you want. All the most beautiful beaches, dolphins, tropical plants, like whatever is the greatest, it's got it there. And it's got it in the maximal amounts. This is what Gaunlio is saying. Now, run that into this argument. If Grand Island exists only in the intellect, then we can conceive of a being greater than Grand Island. We can't. Hence, Grand Island, it's not the case that Grand Island exists only in the intellect. Now, it either exists only in the intellect or exists in reality. Hence, Grand Island exists in reality, according to Gaunlio. Now, this is valid, and it has the same form as Anselm's argument. So, whatever you think about Anselm's argument, it's likely you should think the same about this argument. Now, if you think this argument sucks, and this is not plausible, the conclusion is clearly false, because it is, then that'll give you some reason to suspect that Anselm's argument has gone wrong somewhere, even though it's not clear which premise is problematic. Okay, let's move on now to an argument from sufficient reason. This is also a bit of an argument from reason and rationality, but of a different sort than we just saw. So it's not trying to pull, the existence of God like a rabbit from a hat, as Anselm's argument was designed to show. It's also not a style of argument that rests on a lot of empirical premises, just the plausibility of an explanation for what the world is and why it is the way it is. So let's look at this. This is from Gottfried Leibniz. The argument trades on the plausibility of the following principles that deserve unpacking, or the following principle that deserves unpacking. This is the principle of sufficient reason. For each contingent thing, there is an independent sufficient reason. Let's say more about what that means. Look, for each contingent thing, okay, remember a contingent thing is such that there's some time at which that thing does not exist. You and I are contingent things, for instance. There is, in contrast, 2 + 2 = 4, not a contingent thing. It's always the case. Now, independent. What is independent? X is independent of Y if and only if X and Y are not identical and they have no parts in common. Okay. So the only thing left to do then is look at this sufficient reason part. Now, X is a sufficient reason for Y if and only if facts about X fully explain why Y exists and is as it is rather than some other way. Let's illustrate with some examples. Consider my computer cover is not perfectly smooth. It has a few bumps and nicks. Why does it exist and why is it not perfectly smooth? Well, the folks who manufactured my computer cover, plus me being a bit careless sometimes, provide a sufficient reason for why my computer cover isn't perfectly smooth. We're contingent, we don't overlap in parts, and these facts provide a full explanation for the computer not being perfectly smooth. There's a tree outside my window. Why does it exist and why is it an oak and not an elm? Sufficient reason might be because of the acorn the tree grew from. More generally, and I'll just appeal to Futurama here, in case you haven't seen the show, please do. There's an episode where the professor, this brilliant scientist, has solved all of the problems of the world, solved all of the big theory physics questions of the universe. He's finally identified the one equation that solves everything. The professor, who spent his life attempting to find such an equation, gets all the accolades you would expect. He wins many prizes, Nobel Prize, etc. But he's also very sad because there's nothing else for him to do. He solved it all. Until one day, one of the dumber characters in the show says, "Oh, that's interesting, Professor. I wonder why it's that way rather than another." And the professor's response, I think, is very telling. He says, Fry, the person's name is Fry who said this, "You idiot, you're a genius. Why is it the case that things are this way rather than another? I'm going to need millions of dollars and thousands of graduate students to answer this question." The idea here is that the professor is after the sufficient reason, an explanation for why things are as they are rather than some other way. And that is what's underwriting the principle of sufficient reason. The claim here again is everything that's contingent has some explanation. Things happen, they say, for a reason. And that is basically what this principle says. Imagine if somebody told you there was this thing, smoggle, and it exists, but there's no explanation for why. Not that there's an explanation we don't know about, or perhaps couldn't know about, but there's literally no explanation for why smoggle exists. I think that'd be a bit hard to believe. Now, before turning to the argument in earnest, we need some more ingredients. So, a definition of the world. What is the world? X is the world, if and only if X is the aggregate, and is a collection consisting of every contingent thing that ever did exist, does not exist, or ever will exist. So anything that could exist that is contingent. I could have had hair. You could have been taller. You could have been shorter. All of these possibilities. Put them together in one hypothetical bundle and call that the world. Every dinosaur star, your great-grandchildren, and so on, everything's included in there. Here's the argument. The world is a contingent thing. If that's true, then there's some independent sufficient reason for the world. And if there is some independent sufficient reason for the world, then God exists. Hence, God exists. Now, it is valid. Is it sound? Let's examine the premises. Premise 1. We can be sure that the world exists. I mean, we're in it, right? Like, I'm existing, I'm a contingent thing, so therefore the world. I'm at least part of the world. So each part of the world, as by definition, is contingent. But if every part could have failed to exist, then the world itself could have failed to exist, as we've defined it. Hence, the world is contingent. Now, premise 2, suppose that the world is a contingent thing. According to the principle of sufficient reason, every contingent thing has an independent sufficient reason. Since we've already provided justification for thinking the principle of sufficient reason is plausible, this implies 2 is true. Now, suppose there's an independent sufficient reason for the world. If that reason were contingent, and here's the crux, then it would be part of the world, and so not independent of it. Remember, it has to be independent. Hence, the sufficient reason must be a necessary thing, a necessary existent. Guess what? Remember one of those properties that God had is necessary existent. Hence, Leibniz concludes it must be God. Now, you might wonder about some of these premises. We argued that the world is contingent because each part is, but this is not in general true. Consider that Fred weighs less than 400 pounds, Ed does as well, so does Ted, and all the other members of the Buffalo Bills do too. But that doesn't mean that together the team weighs less than 400 pounds. But this is the same sort of reasoning that's going on here, right? To support the world being a contingent thing. All of the parts are contingent, so it's contingent. Look, all of the parts of the Buffalo Bills weigh less than 400 pounds, but it doesn't mean the Buffalo Bills weigh less than 400 pounds. You also might object to 3. We might object that even if there is an independent sufficient reason for the world, we shouldn't leap to the conclusion that omnipotent, omnibenevolent, etc. sorts of entities or an entity created it, right? We only, if anything, established that something necessary had to exist that was the sufficient reason for the world being one way rather than another, but it doesn't mean that that thing is omnipotent and all-powerful, all good. In fact, it could be quite evil. We don't know. Maybe this world could have been better than it is. Maybe the contingent things that we are could have been improved. I mean, I could have had luxurious hair. I mean, that seems like a plus. Instead, I've just got to live with this beard. Anyway, okay, moving on. But hopefully you see the points of objection that you might level against this argument. Let's turn away then to close out this conversation away from the more logical and reasoning based, more logical styles of argument for the existence of God and perhaps look at some practical reasons. You might think we've been going up in a balloon with all these arguments. Perhaps we should reflect on whether instead we have good reasons, like just as a day-by-day living in the world entity to believe that there's a God. For example, belief might help avoid the risks of hell and aid in the chance of experiencing heaven. That seems like good practical reason. Blaise Pascal posed an argument in favor of God's existence based on this sort of reasoning. He argued we do have practical reasons to believe God exists. In fact, he claimed we should treat the decision to believe in God the same way we treat any decision under uncertainty. Suppose you're planning to leave your house. It's warm outside, right? But there's a 50% chance that it'll become cold. Should you take a jacket? You're reasoning under uncertainty. How do you do this? Here's how Pascal suggested. I mean, many people do suggest thinking about it this way. A little table here. 50% chance of it being warm, 50% chance of it being cold. Now, suppose you wear a jacket. There's a 50% chance of it being warm. Now, suppose it is warm and you bring a jacket. Now, that negative 50 is supposed to describe a sort of utility that you've lost in bringing a jacket. You got to lug it around, right? It's warm. You don't end up using it. You got to carry it. Now, on the other hand, if you look over on the right-hand side under cold, you see that plus 100. That is the positive utility you get. Like, you chose correctly. You get a plus 100 happiness points or something because it was in fact cold and now you've got a jacket that you're using. Now, if you look in the no jacket part, you don't take a jacket, you get a plus 75, we'll say. Plus 75 happiness when it's warm because, yeah, you're feeling good, no jacket, you didn't have to lug it around, and you don't need it. Now, on the other hand, if it's cold outside, you see negative 100. You didn't bring a jacket. Now you're shivering. Your friends are making fun of you. Everybody's laughing. You can't tell what the joke is because your lips are quivering too much and you can't hear anything. With this table, how do we decide what to do? We've just assigned, like intuitive assigning here of like that sort of happiness you might experience under these different conditions. You might have like negative 50 happiness, plus 100, and plus 75, negative 100. And hopefully this sounds somewhat intuitive. If not the specific numbers, then maybe structurally in relationship to the other numbers, it sounds reasonable. How do we use this to make a decision? Pascal would say, calculate. 50% chance of having negative 50 plus 50% chance of having 100 equals 0.25 expected utility, like the expected happiness. If you don't take a jacket, you run the numbers, you'll end up with a negative 12.5 expected utility. Now, the upshot here is, hopefully, it's obvious that you should take a jacket because 0.25 expected value or expected utility is better than negative 12.5 expected value or expected utility. And this is a sort of reasoning under uncertainty that Pascal would recommend to anybody in general, but also the sort of expected utility he thinks applies when we're thinking about whether there are good reasons to think or believe that God exists. Suppose you believe in God and there is a God. Infinite happiness. You get to go to heaven. Suppose there's no God, but you believe. All right, so you didn't drink. You were abstinent. You didn't cuss. Like a negative value, right? Like there's some cost to that because you believed wrong. Okay, so negative 1,000, we'll say. Suppose you don't believe there's a God and there is a God. Negative infinity, right? Because you're going to hell, according to Judeo-Christian conception. Now, if there is no God and you believe you chose correctly, you get to do all those things, the opposites of those things I was just describing. You get a plus 1,000 value or a plus 1,000 happiness, okay? Still, let's run the numbers. If there's a God, you get infinite happiness. If there's no God, you get negative infinite happiness. So the way that the numbers work out in this scenario is that infinities swamp whatever value or disvalue you have under the no God condition. According to Pascal, this is like just clearly good reason to think or practical reason to believe that there is a God, right? You get, because in the condition where there is a God, you get infinite happiness. And in the condition where there's no God, you get infinite sadness. What do you think? Does this make you think we should believe in God? Is this practical reason enough for you? Let's see if we can poke some holes. Just one hole real quick. Now, we're thinking of the existence of one God, like, the Judeo-Christian conception, but this is supposed to be general. And we don't really know what sort of situation we're in, right? We're just trying to get practical reasons for the existence of God, right? But there could be another God, an evil God, called Voldemort, we'll say. And Voldemort punishes you if you believe in God. So in the scenario where there's God and Voldemort, they both exist, and you believe in God, you get infinite happiness. Now, if there is no God, but there is a Voldemort, then Voldemort punishes you, and you get negative infinity. You're going to hell. Now, in the case where there's no God and no Voldemort, negative 1,000, right? You were believing, but you gave up all those other things you wanted to do because you were believing. Well, now suppose you don't believe, and there's a God and a Voldemort. Okay, you don't believe, Now, Voldemort's not going to give you credit, but God's going to punish you. So negative 1,000 or negative infinity. On the other hand, if there's no God and there is a Voldemort, well, you get positive infinity. Because no God, but you don't believe, so Voldemort's not, he's all happy about that. Give you a positive infinity. And now if there's no God and no Voldemort, you just get that plus 1,000. Let's run these numbers. We don't really have to. If the payoff matrix looks like this, it's not clear whether we should believe in God or not, because the issue is we don't know what scenario we're in, because these would swamp one another out. If we believe in this scenario, the infinities will drop away. The infinity and the negative infinity cancel each other out, and so we've got negative 1,000. If we don't believe, we get positive 1,000. This is the opposite scenario, or the opposite outcome of the previous wager. So because we don't really know whether we're in the previous table or this table with Voldemort and God, I conclude from this observation that Pascal's wager does not give us good practical reasons to believe that God exists.